becoming a Catholic.
Why can't women become priests?
1-833-288-EWTN.
I don't understand why I have to earn salvation.
1-833-288-3986.
What's stopping?
Why do I need to confess my sins to a priest?
What's stopping you? This is Called to Communion with Dr. David Anders on the EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network.
And we welcome you to another week of Call to Communion here on EWTN. This is the program for our non-Catholic brothers and sisters. If you've got a question for, someone who understands the Catholic Church, do give us a call. Or if you'd like to tell us why you are not a Catholic, tell us what's stopping you from becoming a Catholic. Here's our phone number, 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. If you're listening to us outside of North America, please dial the U.S. country code and then 205-271-2985. You can also text the letters EWTN to 55000. Wait for our response and then text us your first name and your brief question. Message and data rates may apply. And if you'd like, you can always send us an email, ctc@ewtn.com. The address, ctc@ewtn.com. All right, Charles Beery is our producer. We also have Matt Gabinski handling the phones. We would love to talk with you this afternoon. I'm Tom Price along with Dr. David Anders.
Tom, how are you today?
Very well. How are you, my friend?
Oh, I'm hanging in there. Very middling.
I want to give a little shout out to our friends at Ave Maria Radio, celebrating their 25th anniversary on the air.
Yay, congratulations.
I can remember when they got started. It was, one radio station. Now they've got a whole passel of radio stations, and they're creating wonderful content for EWTN and for their own consumption 24 hours a day.
Gotta love them.
Gotta love them. We're going to lead off today with a very interesting call from our EWTN listener comment line.
My name is Stephen, and the question is posed by a parishioner for having a question and answer session. Why is it that in Catholic churches, as parishioners or new people come into the church physically, walk into the building, there are not much fellowship? It doesn't seem to be very friendly compared to other churches. Is there a historical reason for it or scriptural reason for it? I'd like your opinion about Dr. Anders. Thank you. God bless you. Bye-bye.
There we are.
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate the question. So there are some answers. There are no good justifications. And, in fact, we ought to share friendliness and amicability to people. St. Thomas Aquinas says that to be amiable towards someone is included within the virtue of justice. Because, see, justice is giving people what they deserve. And people deserve a kind word, a smile, a handshake, a friendly greeting, acknowledgement of their humanity, their dignity, and neighborliness. I mean, these are just normal, everyday human virtues and skills, and we owe them to people, whether we know them or not, and all the more so in the household of God. So we ought to treat people kindly, and we ought to acknowledge them and make them feel welcome. Now, I can say that within the sanctuary of the church, we try to inculcate a culture of reverence and respect to the Blessed Sacrament and as a place of prayer. And so, sitting in the pews before the Blessed Sacrament is not the best place necessarily for slapping folks on the back. But there are other ways to accomplish that goal outside the sanctuary. And Catholics have historically, in the United States, done a poor job of that. Now, I think there are some historical reasons why that is the case that, like I said, they're not justifications. I think they're just explanations. And I think they just go deep into American Catholic history. When you look to Catholic Church 100 years ago, 150 years ago, in our country, largely a church of immigrants, initially really sort of centering in the major cities. And typically, churches and parishes grew up around different ethnic groups, Italians, Poles, Irish, Lithuanians, these sorts of things. And because folks were related to one another by marriage, by ethnicity, they tended to know their neighbors because they lived in the same neighborhoods. In fact, some more Catholic cities in America still think about geographic territorial boundaries within the city in terms of their parishes. And in a culture like that, you don't necessarily need to generate programming or to be intentional about, how can we have a welcoming committee at the front of the church, because everybody already knew each other, right?
Yeah.
And then you sort of fall into a way of doing business, and society change and culture changes, but you don't necessarily change your habits and your customs to accommodate them. And another aspect of that, part of the century, last century, Catholics tended to have a kind of siege mentality towards the wider American culture, and there was a great deal of anti-Catholicism in the wider culture, and Catholics had a sense of themselves as a minority community, sort of turned inward to protect themselves. And that did begin to change after the Second World War, the GI Bill, the growth of the suburbs. But again, the habits didn't follow the changes in sociology or demography. Now, to the church's credit, there are a lot of people who've put their finger on this as an issue and recognize that we need to do something about it. I don't think we necessarily moved fast enough or far enough to meet that human need. But you put your finger on a neuralgic point, and I really couldn't agree with you more.
All right, very good. Here is a question now that came in from Nick via YouTube. What happens to your marriage if you are married before you became Catholic, both spouses?
Okay, so a little bit ambiguous the way the question is stated.
It is, yeah.
I presume that, you're not a Catholic and your wife is not a Catholic, and then one of you becomes a Catholic. Well, if you're validly married, you're still validly married. And so you're a married person who's now a Catholic. Okay? Now, if you were baptized people at the time of your marriage, even if you weren't baptized as Catholics, you automatically have a sacramental marriage, even though you weren't Catholic, because it's in virtue of your baptism that you have the capacity to realize a sacramental marriage. So that wouldn't necessarily change things. The only situation that might be a little odd, and you rarely see this, is when you have two non-Christian people, one of them becomes a Christian, and the non-Christian spouse refuses to live with the Christian on account of their Christianity.
Yeah.
Says, I married an atheist, and now you're a Bible thumper, I'm not going to stay with you, right? That's the Pauline privilege. St. Paul talks about this in the book of 1 Corinthians. It's one of the few times when a Catholic is not bound by a previous marriage. That's one of the few exceptions. That privilege, it's called a privilege, it's an exception to the rule of indissolubility, when a pagan spouse will not accept to live with a convert to the Catholic faith. The church says, we hope they do, but if they go, we can't stop them.
Very good. Nick, thank you so much for watching us today on YouTube. In a moment, we'll be talking with Mike in Indianapolis, Martinez in San Antonio. Two lines open at 833-288-EWTN for Call to Communion.
One of the reasons we should go to Mass is because, if you look in the Catechism, you will see the fruits of Holy Communion. And these are remarkable things that we can receive at every Mass that we attend. We encounter the risen Lord, and He shares something of His divine life and love with us.
The Holy Sacrifice of the Mass, live from the EWTN Chapel, every morning, 8 Eastern, on EWTN Radio and Television.
This is Brian Kemper, a priest for life with Pro-Life Update. Did you know that when an unborn child is still called an embryo, she already has thousands of bodily organs present and functioning? Did you know that the heart of the child at only 8 weeks has already beaten over 7 million times? Now Priests for Life has launched a special project called My Heart Beats Just Like Yours. The unborn baby speaks to us, inviting us to get to know her in the marvelous journey we all made in the womb. This project uses the latest and most striking imagery that exists of the baby in the womb. Go to myheartbeatsjustlikeyours.com to see these images, learn more about this project, and purchase a great brochure about it. Let's meet the unborn child as never before. This is Brian Kemper on the EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network.
It's Call to Communion here on EWTN. Our phone number 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. If you're ready now, let's go to those phones and talk with Mike, a first-time caller in Indianapolis. Mike is listening on our great station there in Indianapolis. Mike, what's on your mind today?
So I'm just wondering, what the church's stance is on transgender people and people of that disposition. I have a relative who's doing that situation, and I'm just wondering, what does the church think on that? How should I conduct myself around that relative?
Yeah, thanks. I really appreciate the question. So clearly, the phenomenon of transgenderism exists. This is a real thing, and at root, it boils down to an individual who does not psychologically identify with their biological sex. Now, there can be a lot of reasons that someone might have that condition. The causes might be purely psychological. Sometimes people can have abnormalities in their chromosomes. They can have deformations in their human formation that can impede the proper biological development of their sex organs, for example. But most of the people, I think, that we're talking about, it presents as a psychological condition of being profoundly uncomfortable or not identifying with a person's biological sex. Clearly, such a condition produces great suffering in the life of one who is so afflicted. And it would seem that the psychology, the statistics on people who are transgendered in terms of their rates of depression and alienation and various other kinds of social problems is very high. And so the church looks at any suffering person with a great deal of compassion and says we should respond compassionately and try to help that individual as much as possible, because they also are made in the likeness and image of God and have a capacity for transcendence and spirituality and spiritual friendship, and we should help them and love them any way that we possibly can without the slightest hint of judgment or criticism or anything that would make them feel dehumanized. Now, what the church does not do is the church does not embrace the ideology of gender theory. And that's something very different from the biological or the psychological, right? The people have biological problems, the people have psychological issues. That's a fact, and we accept that. Gender theory is a theory to account for or explain those facts, and it proposes sociological or political interventions that the church does not endorse. Okay, let me give you an example. If a person has two X chromosomes and produces an ovum and is biologically fitted for bearing children, for parturition of babies, well, biologically, we know that that's female. And typically, human language down through the centuries has corresponded to the biological reality. And we say when we use the word female or woman, we all know what we're talking about. What gender theory says, and the ideology of gender theory says, if you have a biological male and they don't identify psychologically with their biological sex, we should call that person a woman. And moreover, we should bend social institutions and relationships to accommodate that self-assertion in the face of the biological evidence. And in fact, male and female don't name, this is the gender theory, don't name realities in the body. They name states in the mind, and the mental state ought to take priority over the biological reality. That's what gender theory teaches. And it leads to absurd consequences. Like, for example, it would lead to a consequence like you have a male power lifter, and he declares that I'm female, therefore I ought to compete with women in powerlifting competitions, even though I have a massive biological advantage, right, because of muscle and skeletal development and all the rest of it, right? And everybody just says, well, we're going to pretend that the emperor has clothes on and ignore the fact that there are genuine morphological, structural, skeletal, muscular differences between these people, because we're going to assert that the interior disposition is what takes priority over the biological reality. And Church does not hold to gender theory. And so when it comes to our own institutions, one of the sacramental theology and the law of the Church both teach that, say, only a man can be ordained to the sacred priesthood. Well, when we say that, when we say only a man can be ordained to the sacred priesthood, we use the word man in the realistic sense, the biologically realistic sense, the way the word man has always been understood through human history. And so a so-called transgendered man who said, well, I'm a man, I can be ordained to the priesthood, the Church would say, well, not by our definition and not by the biological reality. So you're not proper matter. You're not fit for ordination to the priesthood. And the same thing would go in reverse for those social, societal, ecclesiastical positions that would be restricted to women only.
Okay, well, there you go. Thank you so much for your call, Mike. That opens up a line for you right now at 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. Call to communion on this Monday afternoon here on EWTN Radio. Let's go to Martinez now. Martinez is in San Antonio listening on the EWTN app. Hey, Martinez, what's on your mind today?
Tom and Dr. Anders, thank you for taking my call.
Sure.
Last week, y'all were talking about different denominations, and I noticed that in a Bible verse, it says that there were some people talking about Jesus, and some of the apostles tried to stop him, and Jesus told him, don't do that. Let him speak, because if they're not against us, they're for us. And some Protestants use that as different denominations. Can you explain that to me, please?
Yes, certainly. Thank you. I appreciate the question. So the teaching of Jesus, in this instance, the disciples said, well, we saw some fellows, casting out demons in your name. Should we stop them? And Jesus says, don't stop them. Leave them alone, because, if they're not against us, then they're for us. That is the Church's position. And so, for example, the Church grants to the Protestant churches, to those validly baptized people in other communions, that we should give them the dignity of calling them Christians, because they seek to follow Christ according to the dictates of their conscience to the best of their ability, and in virtue of their baptism and their faith in Christ, they have a right to be called Christian. But we don't think that they have the fullness of the Christian faith. They may have a lot of it, but they don't have all of it. And so we do think there is a fullness of the Christian faith to be found only in the Catholic faith. But we acknowledge there are elements of truth and sanctification outside the boundaries of the Catholic Church, and we're willing to name them as such. Now, but does that principle justify denominationalism? The fact that we're not going to oppose people with whom we share truths. We're not going to oppose them. Does that justify denominationalism? Well, no, no such thing. It does no such thing. Because denominationalism is a completely different idea. Denominationalism is the idea that it does not matter what ecclesial body you belong to. That is a matter of indifference. You could be a Baptist, you could be a Methodist, you could be Episcopalian, you could be a Catholic, you could be Orthodox. Doesn't matter. All right? As long as you hold to, some stipulated core of the Christian faith, it doesn't matter what you belong to. Well, the Church doesn't hold that.
No.
We don't believe that at all. It does make a very big difference which ecclesial body you hold to. The fact that you and I may share some truths of sanctification and redemption doesn't mean that we share all truths. And the differences still matter. So I'll give you a very, very salient example of why differences matter. So between two different Protestant denominations, one denomination will teach that it is lawful to kill your unborn child, and one denomination will teach it is unlawful to kill your unborn child. One denomination will teach it is lawful to leave your wife and children, to go off, with somebody else.
Mm-hmm.
And another denomination will say, no, you have an obligation to your wife and children to stay with them and support them and care for them. Now, even if you don't like them very much, you still have to stay with them because you took a vow, you took a promise before God.
Yeah.
Now, those are very important differences. They're not matters of indifference. To leave your wife or stay with her, to kill your child or let it live. These are not indifferent choices. They radically determine the course of your life and of civilization and of your neighbor. So differences matter. Now, between those two Protestant denominations, there may still be points of commonality. Yay! Good. That's something to celebrate. But that doesn't justify denominationalism. No, far from it.
All right, Martinez, thank you so much for your call. Call to communion here on EWTN. Looks like 2 lines open at the moment, 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. Another quick question here from our EWTN listener comment line.
This is Erin in South Carolina, and I had we have always been given a choice as whether we receive communion in the hand or on the tongue. And now it is being dictated that we are no longer allowed to receive it on the tongue. It's been 20 years since I've ever received communion in the hand, and I'm having a really tough struggle with this. If he could address that and how I can make that work in my head. It just is so against what I have been told I'm allowed to do and what I feel is necessary to do.
Yes, thank you. I really appreciate the question. So we can handle this issue from a couple of different points of view. One of them has to do with the issue of the law, and one of them has to do with an issue of liturgical propriety. As far as the law is concerned, the bishop, of course, has authority to determine the way the liturgy is celebrated in his diocese. Rome, of course, ultimately has jurisdiction over the way the liturgy is celebrated. And the bishop has to be obedient to the Pope, but he is sovereign in his own diocese. And obviously the reason that some bishops have, or some priests have said, we really want you to receive communion on the hand, is out of concern for the epidemiology of the present pandemic and out of interest for the common good. And that's a very high principle to consider, the principle of the common good and human welfare. And there have been situations over the centuries, this is not the only time, when bishops and priests have had to, say, even suspend public mass because of an outbreak of a plague or something like that. And these are reasonable considerations, and the Church seeks to be reasonable, and so that's why we're doing these things. When it comes to the issue of liturgical propriety, first of all, we do not want you to violate your conscience. And if someone were to say to me, it absolutely violates my conscience to receive communion on the hand, it is not possible for me to do so without violating my conscience, then I would say, well, by no means violate your conscience. Better to refrain from receiving Holy Communion than to violate your conscience. And, of course, you're permitted to do that. And you don't have to commune but once a year according to the Code of Canon Law. And frequent communion is not necessary for a robust spiritual life and union with God. So it would be a hardship. But rather than violate your conscience, you could refrain from receiving Holy Communion. On the other hand, I would hate for you to have to make that judgment without a completely informed conscience. And the most important thing to recognize is that you rightly noted that the Church has always granted permission for souls to receive communion either in the hand or on the tongue, at least since the Second Vatican Council. And the Church would not do that if it were not appropriate. And we have the promise of Christ that the Church is not going to fail, and it would be inconceivable that the Church could be in grave prudential error about a matter so central to her identity as the sacrament of the Holy Eucharist, and we can trust the guidance of the Church, and it's ultimately the jurisdiction of the Pope to make these kinds of determinations, not up to the individual soul, and so you can rest easy that the Church is not going to guide you wrong, and if they permit this thing, then it must be licit, it must be allowable, from a position of a liturgical propriety. While there are some differences in context, there is precedent for reception of communion on the hand, even in the ancient Church, even in the writings of some of the fathers like Cyril of Jerusalem. I understand some people object that, well, it's not the same context. Well, no, it isn't. No, it isn't. But the fact of the matter is there's no absolute necessity to receive communion on the tongue. It never has been. So preferences, yes, but absolute necessity, no. So you can trust the Church and unburden your conscience. But if that's impossible for you, then you can always refrain from Holy Communion, and you can offer that up as a sacrifice.
Thanks so much for your call. Call to communion here on EWTN. A quick question now from Rusty in Dorr, Michigan, listening on the EWTN app. Rusty, what's on your mind today?
Hey, first I want to thank him for giving me so often the right words to tell people. Like the thing when he was talking about the gender theory, biological reality. Beautiful. Thank you. Okay, well, my question for our little rosary group that prays a lot for the souls in purgatory is, can they pray for us?
Yes, thank you. Appreciate the question. The answer is probably. Probably, right? The church has not definitively taught this thing, but you can reason it out from what we know about souls in purgatory, namely they're in the state of grace and they're united to God in friendship, and so of necessity they will what God wills, and God wills that the prayers of the faithful be heard and that we all share in the communion of saints and mutual intercession. So it seems reasonable to me to conclude that the souls in purgatory can pray for us, but not meritoriously. Their prayers are not, they don't earn merit by doing so, but they can ask God for favors just like a sinner on earth could.
Rusty, thanks so much for your call. In a moment, Enrique in Houston, also John in Kansas. 3 lines open for you at 833-288-EWTN for Call to Communion. Stay with us.
I'm Brian Patrick with the Catholic Sphere.
This is Catherine Hadro from EWTN Pro-Life Weekly.
This is Raymond Arroyo, host of The World Over.
Get trusted Catholic news every day on EWTN television and radio.
I'm Raymond Arroyo with Mother Angelica, A Remarkable Life. Through the intercession of a woman named Rhoda Wise, Rita Rizzo, Mother Angelica, would be healed of a stomach malady. I'm in that woman's house now. This was Rhoda Wise's house. Mother Angelica actually inherited this house in 1995. Now, the year they first met, in 1943, Christ appeared to Rhoda Wise and asked her to build him a shrine. Though those plans fell by the wayside and never materialized, 60 years later, Mother Angelica would fulfill that promise when she built a grotto right here in 2003. Stay with EWTN as we celebrate the life and legacy of Mother Angelica.
Here is today's quote from Mother Angelica's perpetual calendar. It is in our souls that God does his most magnificent work. The world may look upon the aged, the sick, and the handicapped with sympathy. But God's work in their souls through the power of interior suffering is doing a greater work than when he created the universe. Mother's perpetual calendar is available from the EWTN Religious Catalog at EWTNRC.com.
Tomorrow on More to Life, Fear Factor.
Is fear holding you back? We'll help you increase your confidence and conquer your fears.
That's tomorrow on More to Life. Now back to Call to Communion.
Hey, what's stopping you from becoming a Catholic? Let's talk about it here on EWTN's Call to Communion. Our phone number 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. Matt Kubinski on the JOB. Screen those calls as quickly as possible. We do have 1 line open right now. Here is Enrique in Houston, listening on the great Guadalupe Radio. Enrique, what's on your mind today?
Thank you.
Oh,
I think we just lost Enrique.
That's funny because he just said thank you and then boom, the line disappeared.
You know, I did get a chance to read his question.
Okay.
So
you want to take a crack at it?
Just in case he's listening,
sure.
I think I know what he was going to ask.
All
Right?
right.
He was going to ask about the martyrdom of St. Stephen because he remembered from the Passion narratives that when the crowds confronted Pilate and asked that Jesus be crucified, Pilate said, well, you go crucify him yourself. And their response was, well, we don't have the legal right to execute anybody under the Roman governorship, so you need to do it. We're not going to do it. And so our caller wanted to know, well, if that was the case, then why did they feel justified stoning Stephen, right? If they didn't have the legal right to execute anybody. So I had already kind of begun to formulate a response before he got cut off, unfortunately.
Okay.
And it was that generally lynch mobs aren't too concerned with the law.
Oh, okay.
You know,
when they're that heated up.
Yeah, I mean, people get murdered all the time in defiance of the law.
Oh, yeah.
And this was a situation of Stephen they just had all of him they could take.
Well, there it is. Okay, well, Enrique, sorry that we lost your connection there, but at least we got the call answered. Call to Communion here on EWTN. Our phone number 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. Tom Price here reminding you to join us for the EWTN Rosary. We bring it to you twice a day, 5:30 in the morning Eastern Time with Mother Angelica, 9:30 p.m. Eastern with our dear Father Benedict Groeschel. Let's take one more call here from the EWTN listener comment line, if we could do that, and here it is.
I would like to know why or how come when they said heaven is perfect that we got the bad angels. What happened?
Bad angels.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, very much appreciate it. Well, the word heaven is ambiguous, and it can refer to a few different realities. So sometimes you hear people talk about the heavens, and they just mean the sky. Well, if you've been in Birmingham very long, you know the heavens are not perfect, right? At least they don't coordinate well with my travel plans.
This is true.
All right. Heaven can also refer to the abode of the just after their death, when they go to experience the beatific vision in the presence of God. And that's not what we're talking about either, right? When we talk about the state of the holy angels, when they were created by God, they were created without the benefit of the beatific vision. The angels were not created in a state of bliss. So they didn't enjoy the heaven of the just, the heaven of, what we'll hopefully reach one day in the afterlife. They did have the gift of sanctifying grace, and it was possible for them to love God, but not necessary for them to do so. It wasn't fated for them to do so. And immediately upon their creation, the majority of the angels made an act of obedience to the divine will, and in recompense for their merits were granted the grace of the beatific vision immediately. But a certain percentage made an act of disobedience. We don't really know what it was. They lost the gift of sanctifying grace. They never enjoyed the beatific vision, and they were consigned to hell. And so the fallen angels were never in the heaven of the just. They never enjoyed the experience that the just souls will have in the afterlife. That was never their condition.
Okay, very good. Appreciate that. Thank you so much for your call to our listener comment line. Take those during the overnight hours here at EWTN. Let's go now to Raymond in Jacksonville, Florida, listening on Sirius XM 130. Raymond, what's on your mind today? Hey, Raymond.
Hey, how are you?
Very good. Go right ahead.
My question is, ever since that my grandmother had passed away about 7 years ago, I was born and raised Catholic, and it's just been very hard for me to step foot back into my family Catholic church. And basically my question is, what would I have to do to become a Catholic member?
Yeah, thanks. So when you were Catholic as a child, do you remember, did you make your first Holy Communion?
Yes.
By any chance, were you confirmed?
Yes.
Okay, so from the church's point of view, you don't have to rejoin. You've always been a Catholic, and you're still a Catholic. You're just a Catholic who hasn't been to Mass in 7 or 8 years. So there's no rejoining to be done. You never left. You just stopped going to Mass. And so here's what you would do. If I were you, I would call the parish. Could be the parish you grew up in, could be another parish, and make an appointment to see the priest. You don't have to do it this way. This is just my advice. You could do it another way, but this is what I advise. Make an appointment to see the priest and tell him you want to come in and go to confession. And the reason I suggest an appointment rather than just going, on a Saturday afternoon in line is you may want to talk to the guy for a while.
Mm-hmm.
You may have a lot to say. And go to confession. But also, tell him what's been up in your life in 7, 8 years and why you maybe some of your spiritual needs and so forth. He'll absolve you, including the sin of not going to Mass for 7 or 8 years.
Yeah.
And then you that's all you got to do. Just go to confession. But I think it'd be a good idea to make yourself known to the priest so he could take some pastoral care, on your behalf, as opposed to you could just go on Saturday afternoon and confess anonymously. But then again, you won't have that personal connection.
Yeah, you'll probably get a lot more out of it.
Yeah, and you could, he may could set aside a whole hour for you or something.
Sure.
You could really kind of get to know the guy and let him get to know you, and he could hear your confession, absolve your sins, and then also he may have some practical advice on, ways you could get plugged into the community again, too.
There you go. Raymond, great call. Thanks so much for it. Call to Communion here on EWTN. We have 2 lines open at the moment, 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. Here now, Sharon in Cleveland, listening on our great AM 1260, The Rock. Hello, Sharon. What's on your mind today?
Hello. Thank you for taking my call. I am conflicted by the closed communion table. At the Last Supper, Jesus gave Judas his body and blood. And when I went to confession and talked to the priest about it, he said that Judas was already gone before Christ instituted the Eucharist. But every passage in different versions of the Bible, it seems that Judas is there. Can you help?
Yes, absolutely. So we have to address 2 different issues here. One of them is the question of whether or not Judas was present for the entire Last Supper. And the other one is whether he was or he wasn't. Whether he was or he wasn't, what bearing might that have, or should it have any bearing on the question of who should go to communion? Now, here's one thing we can already know in advance. If Judas received Holy Communion, it was unto his damnation. It certainly did not affect his salvation. He certainly was not in the state of grace at the time, and it did not affect his reconciliation with God. And if he in fact received communion, it only compounded his guilt and made his condemnation that much worse.
Mm-hmm.
And Judas is the only person of whom Jesus said it would be better if he had not been born. It did not go well for Judas. So even if Judas received Holy Communion at the Last Supper, this is hardly a model for how we want sinners to relate to the body of Christ. We don't want something that's going to compound their judgment and make their spiritual situation worse. Now, St. Paul teaches in the book of 1 Corinthians that if we partake of Holy Communion in an unworthy manner, then we are guilty of sinning against the body and blood of the Lord, just like Judas. So again, even if Judas received Holy Communion, wouldn't necessarily be a justification for us to give communion out willy-nilly to every Tom, Dick, and Harry. Now, the truth, when you go to the texts of the Gospels, it is ambiguous whether Judas was present. The texts do not say. The only text that is even sort of slightly intimates that he might have been is the business about the one who's going to betray me is the one who's dipping his bread in the dish. Well, that doesn't sound like that was the Holy Communion, the dipping of the bread in the dish. Doesn't sound like it was Holy Communion. Might have been. Maybe they were receiving, by tinction or something. But it doesn't seem to have been. And the fact is, it's ambiguous. But in the other gospel accounts, there's just no mention of Judas's presence at the moment of the consecration. And so biblical scholars and theologians basically say we don't know whether he was present or not. It's unclear, it's ambiguous whether he was there or not. But really, that's not the way to determine the proper mode of distributing Holy Communion. Now, let me give you the Church's reasoning on why Holy Communion should only be given. It's not just given to Catholics, but given to Catholics where the Church has a right to presume that they're in the state of grace. Because keep in mind, if a Catholic is not properly disposed to receive Holy Communion, the Church does not give them communion.
That's right.
And if I'm a Catholic and I know I'm not properly disposed, I'm not taking communion. I'm going to withhold myself from Holy Communion if I don't think I'm properly disposed. And that's what every Catholic should do. So being a Catholic does not just automatically guarantee that you can have communion anytime you want. You should only take communion when you are properly disposed and when the Church is right to presume that you're properly disposed. Now, why is that? First of all, the holy sacrifice of the Mass is first and foremost an act of worship offered to God. And unlike the sacrifices of the old law, all the priests of the temple had to do was to make sure they were ritually pure. That means they, had to offer certain kind of blood sacrifices. They had to wash themselves, wash their bodies, the outward body, and that was a ritual purification. But it did not necessitate an inward purity, the sacrifices of the old law. Now, Jesus exactly reverses that. he says it's not the ritual washing of the body you need to be worried about. It's the interior purity of your heart that you need to worry about. St. Peter, 1 Peter chapter 2, says that we are a spiritual people, a spiritual kingdom, offering spiritual sacrifices to God. Now, that requires the purification of flesh and spirit of anything that would contaminate out of reverence for God. That's what St. Paul says, 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 7. And so to make the proper offering of ourselves and the Holy Eucharist to God, we have to attend to that interior purification. Now, the church has a role to play in that. That's not just up to me to decide. I don't get to decide, hey, I'm spiritually purified today. It's not up to me to decide. The church actually has the determination in the internal form of the confessional. So part of the role of a priest in the confessional is to verify that the penitent is contrite and that their sins have been absolved and they've done penance. And that soul is properly disposed to go to communion. But the impenitent soul is not properly disposed. Now, since going to communion when you're not properly disposed is spiritually dangerous, it's spiritually dangerous to go to communion when you're not properly disposed. The church rightly says, we are not judging non-Catholics. I mean, we're totally not judging them. We're not judging that they're good. We're not judging that they're bad. We are not judging them. We are only judging Catholics. St. Paul says, this is 1 Corinthians chapter 5. He says, don't judge those outside the church. Rather judge those inside the church. So the church says, okay, that's what we're going to do. We're going to judge Catholics and their proper disposition for Holy Communion, because we have jurisdiction over Catholics. Catholics go to confession. Catholics make their sins known to their priest. Catholics make their repentance known to their priest. So the church has an objective basis for saying, okay, you're contrite. You can come. You believe the faith. You can come. If you're non-Catholic, we're not saying you're good. We're not saying you're bad. We're not judging you. But because we're not judging you, we're not going to give you something that could hurt you. Now imagine a doctor. He's an oncologist. He's got to give chemotherapy to somebody. Mm-hmm. And some guy shows up at his office and says, okay, doc, I'm ready for my chemotherapy. Doctor says, I don't know you. You're not my patient. And the guy says, trust me, I'm properly disposed. You know, I've got cancer. You've got the treatment. It's going to help me. Let's just hook it up right now. Doc says, no way, man. You may be telling the truth. I don't know that. I'm not judging your case. You want to become my patient? Then we'll find out. But otherwise, I can't safely give you this. It might hurt you. And that's what the church says. See, this is not a judgment against the non-Catholic. It's rather the statement, I'm not judging you. Therefore, I can't do this for you safely.
There you go. Sharon, thank you so much for a great call. It's Call to Communion here on EWTN. Hey, tonight on Catholic Answers Live at 6 p.m. Eastern, be sure to join Trent Horn as he discusses being pro-life and persuasive. They go together very nicely. 6 p.m. Eastern tonight right here on EWTN, the exclusive radio home for Catholic Answers Live. Let's go now to Andrea in Houston, listening on the EWTN app. Andrea, what's on your mind today?
Hi, thank you. I'm calling because I've been in conversation with one of my friends who isn't Catholic, and every time we have our conversations, usually it ends or boils down to the fact that I have faith and he does not, and he thinks that faith is the ultimate thing that he doesn't have, and he doesn't think that he can believe anything without it. So I don't know, I just was wondering what could I say to him, or how could I help him?
Yeah, thanks. I really appreciate the question. So first of all, faith is a gift, but it is a gift that we can dispose ourselves to. And so there are things that we can do. So we can put ourselves in a situation where faith is more likely to come. Let's talk about the nature of faith for a moment. Faith is a decision, it's an act of the will, to treat the testimony of another as reliable. So faith is a decision to treat somebody else's testimony as reliable. We all do this all the time, and it's very reasonable to do so. So take, for example, if my wife tells me something that she needs for me to do. Like, let's say she calls me up and says, David, I need you to go pick the kid up from school. You know, my car's got a flat tire. I'm not going to make it on time. I've got no way to independently verify her testimony. You know, I don't have a drone following her around, you know, to verify that she's got a flat tire. I've got to take it on faith that she's telling me the truth. And it's reasonable of me to do that because she's trustworthy. So that's what faith is. I'm making a reasonable judgment to rely on the testimony of another. Now, in the case of the church represents lots of things to me that I cannot independently verify. Some of them I can, like the existence of God or the moral life, but some of them I can't. But her testimony about Christ is reasonable. It's reasonable, and it's reasonable for me to trust it. So there are evidences, we call them motives of credibility, motives to trust that the church's testimony about Christ is reasonable. What are some of those motives of credibility? There's many. I can't possibly go through all of them. Let me go through some of them. One of them's just very salient because it ultimately comes to the purpose of faith, which is that we might be sanctified, and that is the lives of the saints. So I look to those people who have relied on the church's testimony with generosity of spirit and have achieved great heights of personal sanctification, of holiness, of wisdom, of justice, and of charity. And I say, I would like to be like that person. I would like to be like that person. All of us do this. This is part of all of our lives, I think. If you're blessed to have had, a great mentor person and say, I hope when I grow up I get to be like so-and-so. And if you've known a person of faith and you see how much their faith is integrated into their life of holiness and helps them really transcend their circumstances in a what would seem to be a supernatural way, well, it's reasonable for me to say, I want what that person's got. I want what the saints have got. I want the wisdom and holiness of the saints. And they got there by relying on the testimony of the church. I'm going to follow their example and try to imitate their holiness. Yeah. So that's a very powerful motive for credibility. There are, historical motives of credibility. So if I accept the testimony of the church about Christ, I'm going to come to conclusions about the nature of reality, like the dignity of the human person. Now, that is a specifically Christian conclusion. You're not going to find that conclusion in Aristotle. You're not going to find that conclusion in Plato. You're not going to find that conclusion in many other traditions of the world. But the dignity of the human person is a uniquely Christian conclusion that undergirds, stands behind things like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Where'd the idea of human rights come from? This is a gift of Christian society to the world. Well, if you value that, if you think that says something true about reality, well, that's grounded in the faith of the church. That's a reasonable. That gives me a good motive for wanting the faith of the church to be true, for wanting to align myself with the faith of the church, so that I can find myself concurring with the church's judgments in things like morality and ethics, dignity of the human person, care for the poor. These are specifically Christian conclusions that flow from Christian revelation. We take them for granted in the modern world. We just think they're just normal. They're not normal. They're not historically normal. These are the gifts of the Catholic faith civilization. What about the extraordinary person of Jesus? The extraordinary person of Jesus. And the most extraordinary thing he did was rise from the dead before witnesses. And the historical evidence for Christ's resurrection from the dead, or the fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy. We could go on and on and on. These are what we call motives for credibility, reasons to treat the church's testimony as trustworthy, and to make an act of faith, to rely on another's testimony for good reason, is a very reasonable thing to do. So if someone does not have faith and they would like to have faith, I would say do a number of things. Number one, begin to review in your own mind the motives for the credibility of the Catholic faith. Second of all, begin to make acts of obedience that would be concurrent with faith. So like a very faithful person thing to do would be to pray. So you put yourself in this position. I don't know if there's a God up there. I don't know if anybody's listening, but I'm going to start praying the way the church says to pray. Our Father who art in heaven, thy will be done, not mine. forgive my sins, help me to forgive others. See, I'm not going to be praying for Ferraris and Lamborghinis and all that, praying the way the church tells me to pray. Start doing the things of faith, the acts of faith. Put myself in a community of faith. Start reviewing the motives of credibility, because it's reasonable to do so and the rewards are great. That's what I would tell a person who is struggling with an act of faith.
Andrea, thank you so much for your call from Houston. Let's go to Colorado now. Wayne is driving through Colorado, listening on the Great Catholic Radio Network. Hello, Wayne. What's on your mind today? Wayne?
Hey, Wayne.
Hey, Wayne. Are you there?
Oh, thank you. I'm sorry. For some reason, my big ear hit my mute button.
Uh-oh.
I thank you very much for taking my call. I learned so much from this station. It's incredible. I'm addicted to it. So thank you guys so much for this. My question is about communion. I've been confused as to venial sins versus mortal sins and when I can go to communion or not. And as an example, when I'm in church, it seems like everybody there goes through communion. And I go to confession fairly regularly. And as an example, last week I came out of confession, and a guy turned right in front of me and I said a swear word or two. And so I get confused.
I can help you.
Okay, thank you.
So first of all, you're never going to find a list. The church is never going to publish a list and say, here are all the mortal sins. All right, and you could not do so. You could not do such a thing. It would be impossible to do this. I'll tell you why. In order for a sin to be genuinely mortal, you have to have three things. All right, the objective act is only one of them. You have to have an act that's objectively grave. Now, when I'm talking grave, I mean a grave dereliction, a grave denigration of human or divine dignity. Okay, and so grumbling under my breath, at my neighbor because of his, his squeaky boots or something, and killing him are vastly different in terms of the gravity of the action. One of them really, really, really just destroys the image of God in someone, and one of them is just, me grumbling, all right? So it has to be a grave action. It would be recognizably grave by, by the judgment of the church at large. Secondly, I have to do it intentionally. So it's not just a reactive automatic thing. And third, I have to do it freely and not under compulsion. All right. If I have all three of those, then I have a mortal sin. If I have only two of them or only one of them or none of them, then I don't have a mortal sin. All right. Now, I don't like to sit here and specify this is a mortal sin, this is not a mortal sin. But in my judgment, I wonder if you don't tend a little bit to scrupulosity. And the scrupulous person is the one that finds a mortal sin under every bush, all right, and is constantly afraid they're in the state of mortal sin. No, that's not the way Christian life is meant to be lived, right? And remember that the motion of our passions is morally neutral. When I have a passion that moves me irrationally in some direction, the motion of my passion is not a morally relevant consideration. Like, I'm not guilty of something because I have a strong urge to do something that might be bad, all right? I'm only bad insofar as I concur with that motion and do it. I can have all kinds of temptations, all kinds of sort of passionate feelings. Those are just the conditions of moral action. They fall short of moral action.
Okay.
So go easy on yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. Wayne, thank you so much for your call. Couldn't get to a great question from Daniel on Facebook, Bradley on Facebook. We're going to save those for tomorrow's program. Also couldn't get to Mike in Atlanta. Please call us back tomorrow. U2K in New Jersey. Dr. David Anders, thank you so much.
Thank you, Tom.
See you tomorrow right here on EWTN's Call to Communion. I'm Tom Price, looking forward to our next visit. We will see you tomorrow. God bless.
Hello, Journey Home family. Next time, we'll welcome